Nearly a year had passed, but I could still hear the silver spoon tapping against my sister's champagne glass. 3 bright notes. Delicate, cheerful, impossible to mistake for a warning. Beyond the windows of Cedar Vale Lodge, September wind dragged across the lake and pressed cold fingers through every gap in the old timber walls. The room smelled of cedar smoke, expensive perfume, and the white roses Tessa had ordered from Manhattan because local flowers, according to her, looked cheap in photographs. My mother lifted her glass and smiled at me across the table. "Still pretending you have a fiancé, Meredith?" Constance asked, loud enough for the people at the next 2 tables to hear. My father did not even bother looking at me. Arthur turned toward Malcolm Pierce, the founder and executive chair of the company where Dad had spent most of his adult life. "No man would choose her," he said, as if discussing a failed investment. Pathetic. I did not answer. A low vibration rolled through the floor. The wine in every glass trembled, and 30 heads turned toward the wall of windows. Outside, a helicopter descended toward the lodge's licensed landing pad, scattering red leaves across the lawn. A man stepped out in a dark flight jacket, crossed the terrace, walked straight to me, and pressed his lips to the back of my hand. Malcolm Pierce immediately stood to greet him. "Before I tell you why my parents looked as though the floor had shifted beneath them, I hope you're doing well. Stay with me to hear what happened next. And please subscribe to the channel if family stories about betrayal, truth, and hard-earned justice are your kind of story." The engagement dinner had started 40 minutes earlier, and until my mother raised her glass, I had been doing exactly what I came to do. I congratulated Tessa. I complimented Dean's mother on the flowers. I posed for family photographs without correcting the seating card that placed me beside the service door, 3 seats away from everyone else named Whitlock. That was not surrender. It was planning. Gavin had asked whether I wanted him beside me when the dinner began. I had told him no. His regional rescue exercise was scheduled to end at Cedar Vale that evening, and his crew had a debrief in the West Conference Room. The lodge knew they were coming. Their names were on the flight manifest. Their route had been approved before Tessa mailed her invitations. My family knew only that I was engaged. They did not know his name because I had spent the previous year learning that privacy and secrecy were not the same thing. Privacy was a door I closed by choice. Secrecy was the locked room my parents had built around my life and called protection. The new ring on my left hand caught the candlelight when I reached for my water. Gavin had given it to me that spring, beside a half-frozen lake with mud on both our shoes and a thermos of coffee between us. There had been no photographer hiding nearby, no violinist, no crowd waiting to applaud. He had asked one question, and I had taken my time answering it. Tessa had noticed the ring before I removed my coat that evening. "It's tasteful," she had said, turning my hand toward the light without asking. Her own diamond sat high above a band of smaller stones and snagged the lace cuff of her dress whenever she moved. "I suppose that's wise when no one knows what your fiancé actually does." "He works," I had replied. Tessa gave a small laugh and released my hand. "That's not much of an answer." "It was the amount of information I intended to give," I said. Dean looked down at his place setting. My sister's smile remained in position, but one manicured finger tapped twice against the stem of her glass. Tessa had never liked a boundary she had not drawn herself. By the time dessert plates arrived, my mother had asked 4 times whether Gavin was coming. Each question wore a different dress. Was he shy? Was he delayed? Had we argued? Did he travel for work, assuming he had work? Dad added little comments from the head of the table, polished enough to pass as humor if no one listened too closely. I had decided before driving north that I would not fight for my dignity in a room where everyone had been invited to watch me lose it. If they crossed the line, I would congratulate Dean, leave my gift with the event coordinator, and go upstairs. My bag was already packed. My room key sat in the inside pocket of my coat. Then Mom lifted her glass. The guests nearest us quieted first. Dean's parents looked from my mother to me, their expressions tightening with the helpless concern of people who had walked into a family argument without knowing where the exits were. Malcolm did not laugh when Dad called me pathetic. His hand remained flat beside his plate, and the corner of his mouth pulled down. I pushed my chair back an inch. That was all. The vibration reached us before the sound. Crystal chimed against china. The manager hurried through the dining room and opened the terrace doors as rotor noise hammered against the glass. The North Star team has landed on schedule, the manager announced. Their debrief room is ready. My mother leaned toward Malcolm. Are these your guests? Constance asked, suddenly eager to attach herself to whatever importance had arrived outside. Not mine, Malcolm said. The helicopter settled beyond the lawn, where painted markings cut a pale circle through the fallen leaves. 2 crew members stepped down first and headed toward the west entrance with their equipment bags. Gavin came last, one hand holding a slim document case against his side. Wind flattened his dark hair, and the collar of his flight jacket stood open at his throat. He saw me through the terrace doors. The tightness between my shoulders eased before he reached the room. Not because I needed saving. I had known how to leave long before Gavin arrived. What changed was simpler. For once, my family was about to meet a fact they had not been allowed to edit. Gavin crossed the floor without hurrying. Conversations thinned behind him. He stopped beside my chair, took my hand, and kissed it just above the new ring. Sorry I missed dinner, Gavin said. The weather pushed the final drill 20 minutes late. You made it before the speeches, I replied. Then I timed it perfectly, he said. Malcolm's chair scraped back. Gavin Rourke, he said, extending his hand. I didn't know North Star had put you in charge of tonight's exercise. Gavin shook it. I was only leading the air section. County Emergency Management ran the full operation. You still owe our advisory board a report on the winter evacuation drill, Malcolm said. It's on your desk Monday morning, Gavin replied. Their exchange lasted less than half a minute, but it was enough. Dad's shoulders had gone stiff beneath his dinner jacket. He knew Malcolm did not offer standing greetings to strangers, and he knew the founder of Pierce Infrastructure had addressed Gavin as a colleague, not as hired entertainment or an ambitious guest seeking attention. Mom recovered first. She always did. Well, Constance said, smoothing the front of her dress, this is certainly dramatic. Meredith might have mentioned that an old friend was joining us. Gavin looked at me before answering. I'm not an old friend. I rested my hand on the back of my chair. Gavin is my fiancé. A fork struck a plate somewhere behind Tessa. Dean's mother inhaled softly. My sister did not move, though the skin around her mouth tightened. Dad gave a short laugh. So that's what this is, Arthur said, a reunion dressed up as an engagement. Arthur, Malcolm said, his voice quiet. Dad ignored the warning. Gavin and Meredith had a youthful attachment years ago. It ended badly. Apparently nostalgia has made it look more important than it was. Gavin did not challenge him. He placed the document case on the table and opened the brass clasp. The sound was small, but every person close enough to hear it stopped moving. From the case, he removed a worn blue ring box and a yellowed business envelope. He set both beside Dad's champagne glass. The old ring remained inside the box. A slim oval sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds, the setting slightly uneven because Gavin's grandfather had made it for his grandmother after the war. I had worn it for less than a year. Gavin had kept it for 17. Dad stared at the envelope instead. Do you remember sending this from your office in April of 2008? Gavin asked. Arthur's hand closed around the stem of his glass. Meredith returned your ring, he said. I mailed it as a courtesy. Gavin turned the envelope so the writing faced me. Pierce Infrastructure's old return address sat in the upper left corner. The postmark was faded but readable. Beneath Gavin's name, one sentence had been written in my father's square, heavy hand. At Meredith's request, my fingertips rested against the tablecloth. The fabric was rougher than it looked. I never asked you to send it, I said. Dad finally met my eyes. You were upset. Your mother and I handled a difficult situation for you. You took it from my safe, I said. Meredith, don't turn this into something ugly, Mom warned. Her voice dropped into the soft tone she used when she wanted witnesses to believe she was calming me down. It was already ugly, Gavin said, but his voice stayed level. I brought the original because Arthur has told this story for 17 years, as if Meredith placed the ring in his hand. She didn't. Tessa leaned forward. The movement was slight, no more than an inch, but her gaze fixed on the lower right corner of the envelope. Then she looked at the postmark, the return address, and the sentence beneath Gavin's name. Her champagne glass remained halfway to her lips. I watched the color drain from the knuckles holding the stem. "Tessa?" Dean asked. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said too quickly. Mom's hand reached across and closed around Tessa's forearm. Not a comforting touch. A stop sign. My sister looked at Constance, and something passed between them that had no place in a room full of celebration. It was not surprise. It was recognition. At the time, I did not know about the storage unit in Albany. I did not know about the 3 letters, the bank statements, or the scan made 8 years earlier. I did not know that my sister had once held a digital copy of that exact envelope on her own laptop. But I knew Tessa's habits. When she lied, she explained too much. When she was frightened, she went silent and stared at the nearest object as though it might tell her which version of the truth would cost her least. That night, she said nothing. Dad reached for the envelope, but Gavin placed 2 fingers on its edge. "The original stays with me," Gavin said. "You can look without touching." Arthur's jaw shifted. "You arrive at my younger daughter's engagement with old jewelry and accusations, and you expect me to treat this like a civilized conversation?" "I arrived for a scheduled debrief," Gavin replied. "You made Meredith part of the evening's entertainment before I walked through the door." Malcolm looked at Dad. "That is accurate," he said. Silence spread outward from our table. It moved through the room more effectively than shouting ever could. Even the servers slowed near the wall, uncertain whether to clear the next course. I closed the ring box. The sapphire disappeared beneath the worn blue lid, but the past did not. It sat between us in the shape of an envelope my father should never have touched, and a sentence my sister recognized before anyone explained it. That was the first moment I knew the story of my breakup had more than one liar in it. To understand why my parents needed Gavin gone, and why Tessa eventually chose their secret over me, I have to take you back to April of 2008, when I was 22, and still believed the hardest choice in front of me was whether love could survive 6 weeks apart. In April of 2008, I was 22 years old and convinced that every hard problem could be solved if I made the right list. I worked as an operations analyst at a hospital in Albany, which meant I spent my days tracking missed appointments, delayed lab results, and supply orders that somehow disappeared between one department and the next. I liked systems because systems admitted when something was broken. A number did not smile at you over dinner and insist nothing was wrong. My grandmother Eleanor had suffered a mild stroke 6 weeks earlier. She could speak, walk with a cane, and argue with the television as fiercely as ever, but her left hand had lost some strength, and bathing alone was no longer safe. She had raised me for long stretches when I was young. Helping her was not the problem. The problem was that my parents had begun speaking as if helping her had become my permanent assignment. One Saturday morning, I spread a printed schedule across my grandmother's kitchen table. Eleanor sat near the window in a blue cardigan, turning her coffee cup slowly between both hands. My father stood at the counter reading the newspaper, while my mother rearranged a bowl of fruit that did not need rearranging. "The agency can send someone Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings," I said. 4 hours each visit. They will help Grandma shower, prepare lunch, and do the exercises from physical therapy. Arthur lowered the newspaper. 12 hours a week seems excessive. It is the minimum the therapist recommended. Constance picked up an apple, polished it against her sleeve, then placed it back in the bowl. "Strangers steal from older people, Meredith. You hear about it all the time. The agency does background checks, and the caregivers are bonded." My mother looked at Eleanor. "Your granddaughter has an answer for everything. That is why I like her," Eleanor said. I slid the schedule toward my parents. Dad's name filled 2 evening slots. Mom's name filled 3 afternoons. Mine covered the remaining appointments and the weekend grocery run. Arthur examined the page as if I had handed him a contract written in another language. "Your mother has obligations. So do I." The newspaper folded with a sharp crack. "We are not saying you don't. You are asking me to delay moving without calling it that." Silence settled over the table. Rain tapped against the kitchen window, and the furnace hummed beneath the floorboards. In 6 weeks, I was supposed to leave Albany with Gavin. He had been accepted into a rescue aviation training program in Alaska, and I had received permission to work remotely for 3 months before transferring to another hospital system. We had planned it carefully. We had also postponed once already. I placed a second sheet beside the first. I can cover the agency deposit and the first 8 weeks from my savings. But after that, the payments need to come from Grandma's care account or from the family. Constance pressed her lips together. Listen to you. Making it sound like an invoice. It is an invoice. Your grandmother is not a business problem. No, but pretending care is free will not make it free. Eleanor gave a quiet laugh into her coffee. Dad did not. Arthur removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Give me time to review the finances. You have until Monday. The agency needs a payer agreement before the first visit. His hand stopped against his face. That pause lasted less than a second. At 22, I noticed it but did not understand it. Years later, after the bank records were opened and every transfer placed in order, I would remember the exact way his fingers froze. Eleanor leaned toward me. There should be plenty. Dad looked at her. Mother, investments go up and down. I sold the western parcel for my care, she said. That was the whole reason. Arthur folded his glasses and set them on the newspaper. The market has been difficult. How difficult? I asked. My father turned his gaze toward me, and the room seemed to narrow. I said I would review it. I would like to see the statements. Constance moved before Dad could answer. She rose, gathered 2 clean plates from the table, and carried them into the kitchen. Meredith, help me for a moment, she said. Nothing needed carrying, but I followed. The kitchen smelled of coffee grounds and the lemon cleaner Mom used on every surface. She set the plates beside the sink, then lowered her voice. Your father is doing his best. I did not say he wasn't. You embarrassed him in front of his own mother. I asked about her money. That is exactly what I mean. You could have asked privately. I have asked privately. Constance reached for my wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but firmly enough to make me look at her. Give him the weekend. Do not drag some lawyer into this before he has had a chance to organize the paperwork. I pulled my hand free. Grandma asked me to look. She gets confused when she is tired. My grandmother had just corrected a television reporter's mispronunciation of a foreign minister's name. Confusion was not the issue. Still, I agreed to wait until Monday. That was one of my faults then. I could draw a boundary clearly, explain it, defend it, and then soften the deadline if someone told me enforcing it would humiliate them. I mistook delay for kindness because the demand remained in place. After lunch, Eleanor asked me to bring her writing pad. She wrote slowly with her right hand, pressing so hard the pen left grooves in the paper. I, Eleanor Whitlock, authorize my granddaughter Meredith Whitlock to review statements and payment records related to my care account with my attorney. She signed and dated it, then pushed the paper toward me. Call Mr. Feldman, she said. He handled the land sale. Dad had gone outside by then. Through the window, I could see him standing beneath the bare maple tree with his phone against his ear. He saw me watching and turned his back. Gavin arrived at my apartment that evening with 2 grocery bags and a folder thick enough to qualify as a weapon. I brought dinner, he said, placing the bags on my counter. And before you complain, the folder is not a spreadsheet. I opened it. The first page was a spreadsheet. You lied before taking off your coat. I softened the truth. His hair was still damp from the rain, and the sleeve of his jacket smelled faintly of aviation fuel. Gavin had been flying training routes all week, preparing for the Alaska program. He was 24, 2 years older than me, and already carried himself like someone who expected weather to change without asking permission. We ate Chinese food from cartons while he showed me the numbers. He had calculated the rent on a modest apartment near the training base, the cost of storing my furniture, and the price of flights back to New York every 6 weeks. He had even included a column for emergency trips if Eleanor's condition worsened. You made my grandmother a budget category, I said. I made visiting your grandmother a budget category. That is not better. It is if the alternative is pretending plane tickets appear when we need them. I closed the folder. You make my family sound like a scheduling problem. Gavin rested his forearms on the table. Your family creates scheduling problems. My grandmother had a stroke, and you found a caregiver. You made a rotation. You offered to pay for the transition. What else are you supposed to do? Make sure it works before I leave. For how long? 6 weeks. We said 4. The agency needs time to settle in. His jaw moved once. And if your mother decides the caregiver makes Eleanor uncomfortable, then we find someone else. If your father says the account is frozen, I will deal with it. And if Tessa has another crisis? My sister was 17 and had recently decided that applying to college in another state was proof our parents loved me more. She had called me crying 3 nights in a row, though every conversation ended with her asking whether she could borrow my car. Leave Tessa out of this, I said. She is never out of it. The words sat between us. Gavin looked down at the folder, then turned it around so the final page faced me. It was not a budget, it was a form from his training program. I want to list you as a secondary contact, he said. My sister stays first until we are married. But if anything happens, I want them allowed to speak to you. The anger drained from the room so quickly it left me unsteady. I picked up the form. You already filled in my address. You can say no. I am not saying no. We both need to sign, and the program's medical office has to process it. I was going to bring it Monday. I traced the empty signature line with my thumb. Monday. Monday, he repeated. The paperwork remained unsigned on my kitchen table that weekend. That small delay would matter more than either of us could have guessed. 3 days later, Gavin planned a farewell dinner at a restaurant near the river. Nothing fancy, just the 2 of us, because the next phase of his training would begin before my move, and we expected to spend several weeks apart. I was putting on my coat when Mom called. Your grandmother fell, Constance said. My keys slipped against my palm. Is she hurt? She is on the bathroom floor. I cannot get her up. Call an ambulance. She is begging me not to. Put her on the phone. Meredith, for crying out loud, this is not the time to interrogate me. I called Gavin while driving. He answered over the sound of traffic. Are you close? Grandma fell. Mom says she cannot get her up. Do you want me to meet you there? No. I will call when I know what happened. Meredith, if she cannot stand, call emergency services. I know. When I arrived, Eleanor was sitting in her armchair with an ice pack against her elbow. She had not fallen in the bathroom. She had slipped from the edge of her bed while reaching for a slipper, landed on the carpet, and stood up with Mom's help before I left Albany. You said she was on the floor, I told Constance. She had been... You said you could not get her up. I panicked. Eleanor looked from my mother to me. I told her not to call you. Constance crossed her arms. I will not apologize for wanting my daughter here when her grandmother falls. My phone rang. Gavin. I stepped into the hallway before answering. How is she? He asked. Bruised elbow. She is fine. A pause followed. Restaurant noise moved behind his voice, silverware and low conversation. So you are coming? I looked through the doorway. Eleanor was already arguing that she did not need an ice pack. Mom stood beside her with one hand pressed dramatically against her chest. I should stay for an hour, I said. We have a reservation. I know. I leave before sunrise tomorrow. I know that too. His breath moved against the receiver. Then what are we doing, Meredith? My grandmother fell. No. Your grandmother slipped, got back up, and asked your mother not to call you. You were not here. That is the point. I am never there, and somehow I still know exactly what happens next. I stepped farther down the hall. Do not do this tonight. When should I do it? After Alaska? After 6 more weeks? After your father finds another reason the caregiver cannot start? I have handled the caregiver. You think making a plan means your family agreed to let you follow it. My grip tightened around the phone. They do not control me. Then come to dinner. The challenge in his voice cut deeper because it sounded simple. I lowered my own. I cannot abandon the woman who raised me just to prove I love you. And I cannot build a life around a family that gets veto power every time we make a decision. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Behind me, a floorboard creaked. Mom stood at the end of the hallway, watching. I am still moving in 6 weeks, I told Gavin. I want to believe that. Then believe me. I did the first time. The line went quiet again. I will call you when I get home, I said. I will be in the air before dawn. Then call me when you land. He agreed, but the warmth had gone from his voice. I did not know it would be the last real conversation we had for 16 years. That night, I helped Eleanor bathe because she was stiff from the fall. The sapphire ring Gavin had given me caught against the towel and left a thin scratch along her forearm. Eleanor hissed, "I am sorry." I pulled my hand away and examined the red line. "It is only a scratch. I should take this off when I help you." Mom stood in the doorway, holding clean pajamas. "Put it in the bedroom safe," she said. "That setting catches on everything." The safe was an old gray box bolted inside the guest room closet. My parents stored insurance papers and spare keys there. Months earlier, Mom had insisted I use it whenever I stayed overnight because, according to her, leaving an heirloom ring in a purse was asking for trouble. She knew the code. She had chosen it. I placed the ring inside its blue box, set the box beside a stack of documents, and closed the steel door. The lock clicked. On Sunday afternoon, the home care agency emailed me the payer agreement. The first 8 weeks could come from my savings, but future payments required authorization from Eleanor's account or another designated payer. Mr. Feldman's office called an hour later. His assistant confirmed an appointment for Monday morning. Eleanor's signed instruction was enough for them to begin reviewing the power of attorney, recent account statements, and payment authority. Eleanor would attend by phone if she did not feel strong enough to come in person. I wrote the appointment on my calendar. At almost the same time, Gavin sent me a short email from the training airfield. "We are about to start the final route. I am still angry. I still love you. Both can be true. Call me tonight." I read it twice, then typed a reply without sending it. "I am still going with you. I need you to stop treating my family like a weakness I should be ashamed of. I will call after your flight." The accident happened before I finished editing the message. A mechanical failure forced Gavin's helicopter down during the training route. The aircraft hit hard enough to split part of the landing gear and throw him against the restraint system. He lost consciousness briefly, suffered a concussion, and broke his jaw. His sister, Laurel, called me just after dusk. "He is alive," she said before I could speak. "They say he is stable." My knees struck the edge of the couch, and I sat because standing had become unreliable. "Where is he?" She gave me the name of the emergency hospital. It was a little over 2 hours away. I drove through steady rain, following the red blur of taillights until my eyes burned. By the time I reached the hospital, Gavin had already been transferred to a larger medical center with a maxillofacial team. The woman at the desk could confirm only that he was stable and that Laurel was his primary emergency contact. "My name should be on the secondary form," I said. She checked again. "I do not have a completed form in the file." It was still lying unsigned on my kitchen table. I called Laurel twice from the parking garage. Both calls went to voicemail. Then I called my mother and asked her to stay with Eleanor because I was going to follow Gavin to the next hospital. "Of course," Constance said. Her voice was soft, almost tender. "Do whatever you need to do." Years later, their sworn statements and the email records would show me what happened after I drove away. Constance opened the guest room safe. Arthur stood beside her while she removed the worn blue ring box. According to my father's own testimony, he told her they were not ending anything. They only needed to delay me until he could replace the missing money before Mr. Feldman opened the account records on Monday. My mother asked how much time he needed. Arthur said, "Just long enough for Meredith to stop looking." Then Constance lifted my engagement ring from the safe. 2 weeks after Gavin's accident, I had called 3 hospitals, 1 rehabilitation center, his training unit, and his sister so many times that I could recite every automated menu before the recorded voice finished speaking. None of that meant I had reached him. The first 48 hours were the worst. Gavin's jaw had been wired after surgery, and medication kept pulling him in and out of sleep. Laurel stayed near his bed while I drove between Albany and the medical center, checked on my grandmother, argued with my parents, and tried to make sense of information that changed every few hours. On the afternoon after the crash, I sat in the family waiting room outside Gavin's unit with a paper cup of coffee cooling between my hands. The room had 1 public computer against the wall, the kind hospitals kept for families who needed to contact employers or arrange transportation. I signed into my email and opened the message I had started before the accident. "Gavin, I am sorry about last night. I should not have made you feel as if our plans mattered only when my family had nothing else happening. I am still coming with you. I need 6 weeks to make sure Grandma has safe care, and then I will be there. I do not want our last conversation before Alaska to be the one we had. When you are awake and able to talk, I want to say this properly. I love you, Meredith. I read it 3 times before pressing send. The message left my account at 4:14 that afternoon, from the hospital network. Gavin received it, though he was too heavily medicated to reply. Years later, he showed me the printed copy Laurel had placed in his recovery binder. My words were marked with a faint coffee ring near the bottom. The second email was sent a little after 10 that night. I was not at my parents' house. Hospital parking records and a meal receipt placed me more than 2 hours away. At the time, I did not know another message had left my account. I learned the details much later from account records, Gavin's saved file, and the testimony my parents gave when each was trying to blame the other. The second email was longer and colder. It repeated part of the argument Gavin and I had shared over the phone. It said I could not spend my life waiting to learn whether he had survived another flight. It said my grandmother needed me, my family depended on me, and I had finally accepted that love was not enough to build a stable life. One sentence came from a private journal I kept in the guest room at my parents' house. Sometimes loving Gavin feels like standing beside a runway, watching the sky take everything I cannot control. I had written that line months earlier after a training flight had been delayed by weather. I had never sent it to him or said it aloud. My mother had read it. Constance ended the email with a request that Gavin not contact me. She wrote that hearing his voice would only make my decision harder and asked him to respect the life I had chosen. Arthur mailed the ring the following morning from his office. He used Pierce Infrastructure's shipping account and wrote Gavin's Rehabilitation Center beneath the address Laurel had given me. The package contained the blue ring box, a printed copy of the second email, and a brief note in my father's handwriting. Meredith has made her decision. Please respect it. Gavin received the package 6 days after the accident. I know what happened in his room because he and Laurel later described it separately, and their accounts matched down to where the sunlight fell across the blanket. Laurel opened the shipping envelope because Gavin could barely move his jaw and had one arm bruised from the restraint harness. She placed the printed email on the rolling table beside his bed, then opened the ring box. Gavin stared at the sapphire for a long time. He had already seen my first message. Laurel had printed it because reading from a screen worsened his headache. The afternoon email said I still planned to move. The later one said, I had changed my mind. He asked Laurel to check the timestamps twice. The second one came later, she told him. Gavin wrote his response on a hospital notepad. Did she send the ring? Laurel showed him Arthur's note. Gavin closed his eyes, then pointed toward the first email. Do you want me to call her? Laurel asked. He shook his head. At first, Laurel argued. She told him people said strange things when frightened and that no one should make permanent choices during the week of an accident. Gavin listened, then wrote another sentence. If she returned my mother's ring, she meant it. The ring had belonged to Gavin's family for 3 generations. I had worn it every day until it scratched Eleanor's arm. He could imagine me writing an emotional email and regretting it. He could not imagine anyone else opening the safe, taking that ring, and mailing it without my permission. That was why the package worked. My parents did not create a perfect lie. They combined a false message with an object so real that it made doubt feel unreasonable. While Gavin was reading the email, I was trying to reach him. Laurel answered my first call from a hospital hallway. Her voice sounded exhausted. He is awake more often, she said. The doctors are pleased with his progress. Can I speak to him? He cannot talk yet. I can talk. He can listen. A long pause followed. I need to ask him, Laurel said. She called back 20 minutes later. He does not want to call right now. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. Did he say why? He saw your email. Which email? Another silence. I could hear a cart rolling across tile behind her. Meredith, he has been through a serious accident, Laurel said. He needs rest. I sent him a message saying I was still going with him. I should not be in the middle of this. You are already in the middle. Please tell me what he read. Laurel would not discuss it. She was not cruel, and she was not helping my parents. She was protecting an injured brother who had shown her a printed breakup email and his mother's ring. The next morning, I called Gavin's training unit. They confirmed he had been moved to a rehabilitation center but would not disclose the address. Laurel had already asked them to limit personal information because Gavin needed quiet. I found the facility through the discharge information I had seen on a clipboard during my previous visit. The drive from Albany took a little over 2 hours. Rain followed me south, thin at first and then heavy enough to blur the highway lines. At the reception desk, I gave Gavin's name and showed my identification. The woman checked her screen. "Mr. Rourke has requested no visitors under your name." My fingers tightened around the strap of my purse. "Could you ask him again?" "Tell him I drove from Albany." "I am sorry. His instruction is clear." Did someone else make that decision? The request came from the patient. That answer mattered. The woman was not lying, and my parents had not bribed a hospital employee. Gavin had made a real choice after receiving false information. I sat in my car for almost an hour before going back inside. This time I carried a handwritten letter. "Gavin, I do not understand what happened. I sent you one email from the hospital saying I was still coming. If you received anything else from me, please do not assume it was the final word until we speak directly. I am not asking you to make a decision while you are hurt. I am asking you to confirm that the decision to shut me out is yours. I will respect your answer, but I need it to come from you. Meredith." The receptionist agreed to place the envelope with his personal mail. Gavin read it that evening. He later told me the letter frightened him more than the breakup email. It sounded like me. So had parts of the message my mother sent. He began to wonder whether the accident had changed my mind, whether I wanted to return out of guilt, or whether I was trying to soften a choice I had already made. With his jaw wired, his balance unreliable, and nearly a year of medical review ahead before anyone would let him fly again, he did not want me staying because he was injured. Instead of answering, he kept the no-contact request in place. I called Laurel twice more over the next 4 days. The first time, she said Gavin needed space. The second time, her voice became firmer. "He asked me to tell you that he wants you to respect his decision." "Did he say he received my letter?" "Yes." "Did he ask why I said there was another email?" "He cannot handle this right now." "Then when?" "I do not know." I stood in my apartment with the unsigned emergency contact form still on the kitchen table. Rainwater from my coat had dried in a dark line across the floor. "Tell him I will not call again," I said. Laurel let out a tired breath. "I am sorry, Meredith." "So am I." I ended the call and kept my promise. That was not because I lacked questions. It was because I had driven to him, written to him, contacted his sister, and asked for a direct answer. The answer I received was that Gavin wanted distance. My pride did the rest. I could have continued calling from new numbers. I could have waited outside the facility or demanded Laurel carry messages back and forth until Gavin responded. At 22, that would have felt less like devotion and more like begging a man to reconsider a boundary he had deliberately placed between us. So I stopped. Several weeks later, when the medication had cleared and Gavin could speak without writing every sentence, he began questioning the order of events. The first email said I still planned to go. The second reversed everything. My letter denied sending another message. Yet the ring remained in his hand. He wrote to me 3 times. The first letter was sent by certified mail to my parents' house because it was still my legal address. Someone signed for it with the initial C and the surname Whitlock. Constance later claimed she thought the envelope concerned Gavin's medical bills and placed it in Arthur's office. Arthur said he never saw it. The second letter came by regular mail. My mother marked the envelope refused and returned it unopened. The third was a padded package containing a copy of my real email, his account of what he had received, and a note asking me to contact him if returning the ring had not been my choice. Eleanor saw Constance carrying the package toward the trash. "What is that?" my grandmother asked. "Something Meredith does not want," Constance replied. Eleanor took it from her. At that point, she believed my mother's story. Constance told her Gavin had refused to accept the breakup, and that I had asked the family to stop his letters from reaching me. Eleanor did not open the package. She placed it in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser and covered it with old tax records. For years, that was where the truth stayed. My grandmother found the other letters late in 2016, after Arthur and Constance argued in her kitchen about money they thought she had forgotten. By then, Eleanor had begun asking why the care account contained less than it should, and why Tessa's apartment paperwork included a cashier's check with a familiar number. She searched Arthur's desk while he was away. Inside, she found Gavin's first certified letter, the receipt bearing Constance's signature, and copies of bank statements Arthur had not shown her. Eleanor opened the package she had saved 8 years earlier. She gathered the letters, statements, and property records into a wooden box. On the lid, she taped a note written in the unsteady hand that had replaced her once clean script. "Give this to Meredith." Arthur and Constance lied about Gavin. "Ask about the land money. She never managed to place it in my hands." Before Christmas, Eleanor suffered a second stroke. This one took most of her speech and left her unable to explain more than a few words at a time. She moved into assisted living and died the following year. After the funeral, while the family sorted through what remained of her belongings, Tessa found the wooden box. She was 26 years old when she opened it. Old enough to read every letter. Old enough to follow the money. Old enough to understand exactly what our parents had done. And old enough to decide that I should never know. For the first year after Gavin disappeared from my life, I kept expecting grief to behave like an emergency. I thought there would be a clean moment when the alarms stopped, the doors opened, and someone announced what had happened. Instead, I woke every morning, went to work, answered emails, picked up groceries for Eleanor, and carried a question no one around me could answer without lying. Arthur never showed me the care account. Every time I asked, he produced a new delay. The bank had changed its forms. Mr. Feldman was out of town. One statement had gone to the wrong address. The home care agency needed a revised authorization. Each excuse sounded temporary, but together they filled more than a year. I paid only the first 8 weeks of Eleanor's part-time care, exactly as I had promised. When the agency called about the next invoice, I gave them Arthur's number and told him over dinner that I would not cover another payment. My father set down his fork. "Your grandmother needs care." "She has money for care," I said. "You do not know the full financial picture." "Then show it to me." Constance folded her napkin beside her plate. "Must every family meal become a business meeting?" "No," I said. "Only the ones where Dad expects me to pay bills from an account he refuses to explain." Arthur's mouth tightened. "You have become remarkably cold." The word landed exactly where he intended, but I did not pick it up. "If the account cannot pay," I said, "use your own money. I am done paying while you hide the records." 2 weeks later, the agency confirmed that Arthur had signed the payer agreement. That was the first useful boundary I ever enforced with my parents. It was not dramatic. No one apologized. The roof did not collapse. They complained, adjusted, and found a way to do what they had insisted was impossible. 14 months after Gavin's accident, I moved into a small apartment near downtown Albany. The building had thin walls, unreliable heat, and a fire escape that rattled whenever trucks passed below, but the key belonged only to me. I still visited Eleanor twice a week. On Sundays, we played gin rummy at her kitchen table while she accused me of cheating whenever I won. A home care aide came during the day, and Arthur hired additional help for evenings when Eleanor's balance worsened. My mother continued calling whenever something went wrong. A missed delivery. A leaking faucet. Tessa's latest argument with a professor. For a while, I answered every time. Then, one Thursday night, Constance called while I was preparing for an early presentation. "Your father cannot find the insurance renewal," she said. "Did he check the file cabinet?" "He says it is not there." "Then he should call the agent in the morning." My mother went quiet. "You always knew where these things were." "I do not live there anymore." "That does not mean you stopped being part of this family." "No," I said. "It means I stopped being the filing system." I ended the call before she could turn the sentence into evidence against me. Work became the part of my life that made sense. I moved from hospital operations into risk management, then into compliance planning for a regional health system. I learned how failures hid inside ordinary routines. A missing signature could expose a patient record. A delayed inspection could shut down a surgical unit. A manager who said, "We have always done it this way," usually meant no one had checked the process in years. By my early 30s, I supervised a small team. Later, I became director of operational risk. People assumed that made me calm. It did not. It made me good at preparing before anyone else knew there was a problem. My personal life was less orderly. I dated a lawyer named Samuel for almost 4 years. He was patient, funny, and willing to attend my mother's holiday dinners without complaining about the seating arrangements. When he asked me to move into his house, I told him I needed time. 6 months later, I was still keeping half my clothes in my apartment. "You have a drawer here," Samuel said one Sunday morning. After 4 years, I thought I would rate more than a drawer. "I am here most nights. That is not the same as choosing to stay." I looked at the coffee cooling in my hands. "I am not asking you to wait forever." "No," he said. "You are making sure I leave before you have to ask anything of me." Samuel moved on. I told myself the relationship had reached its natural end, though there was nothing natural about the way I packed my toothbrush before he had finished speaking. A later relationship ended faster. Daniel wanted children. I did not know whether I wanted them, and instead of admitting uncertainty, I gave him a list of practical reasons our lives did not fit. He listened until I finished. "You have turned fear into a presentation," Daniel said. I wanted to argue, but the folder on the table made that difficult. Neither man failed me. That truth took longer to accept than blaming my family would have. Gavin lived his own life during those years. I knew only what appeared publicly and what he told me after we met again. His injuries kept him grounded for nearly 11 months. He completed neurological evaluations, regained his medical clearance, and repeated the training needed before he could return to flight duty. By the time he flew rescue missions again, I had stopped searching his name every week. Stopped every week, at least. In 2013, an announcement from a rescue aviation association showed Gavin standing beside a woman named Claire after their wedding. I closed the article, reopened it, then closed it again. He had chosen a life, so had I. Their marriage lasted 5 years before they separated, and the divorce became final the following year. They had no children. Gavin later told me they had not destroyed each other. They had simply built a marriage around 2 people who treated work as the safest place to hide. I saw his name again during floods, winter evacuations, and search operations across the Northeast. Once, a local news station interviewed him after his team located 3 hikers before a storm reached the ridge. His hair had gone slightly gray at the temples. He spoke in the same measured voice I remembered, giving credit to the ground crews and refusing the reporter's attempt to make him the hero. I watched the clip once. Then I watched it again, without sound. He had not vanished. Neither had I. We had spent years existing in neighboring worlds, close enough to find each other and too certain of the past to try. Eleanor died in October of 2017. By then, her second stroke had taken most of her speech and much of her mobility. She lived in assisted care near Albany, where the nurses knew she liked the curtains open before breakfast and hated television game shows. In her final year, she sometimes gripped my hand and tried to tell me something. "Box," she would say. "What box, Grandma?" I asked. Her fingers tightened around mine. "Arthur, letters." I thought she was reaching for an old memory. Arthur had handled her mail for years, and Eleanor had boxes of letters from relatives who had died before I was born. "Do you want me to bring your correspondence box?" I asked. She shook her head, frustrated, but the words would not come. After her funeral, Arthur produced a copy of her will. It had been signed years earlier, while Eleanor still had full capacity and filed with her attorney. Arthur was named executor. Tessa and I were equal beneficiaries of the remaining personal property and a modest share of whatever remained after expenses. The estate went through Albany County Surrogate's Court. Arthur received authority to act as executor, and the process stretched into the following year. When the accounting packet arrived, I read every page. The care expenses were higher than I expected. There were payments to agencies, medical transportation services, home modifications, and private aides whose names I did not recognize. Some costs were supported by invoices. Others were listed in broad monthly totals. I marked the questionable entries with yellow tabs and called Arthur. "These private care charges do not identify the provider," I said. "They were independent aides," he replied. "Where are the receipts?" "In Mother's older files." "Then send copies." Arthur sighed into the phone. "Meredith, she needed more help than you understood. You visited. You did not manage the daily care." The remark was designed to move the conversation from documents to guilt. "I am asking for records, not a review of my behavior." "You sound like an auditor." "I am an auditor." Arthur sent additional pages a week later. The receipts were uneven, but they covered enough of the reported expenses to make the totals possible. I photographed every page, saved the accounting packet in 2 places, and signed the release. It was a mistake. Not a foolish one. Not an impossible one. I had no evidence then that the account had been emptied years before, and I did not know Eleanor had collected separate bank statements. Grief made the quickest clean ending look like mercy. I accepted records that were incomplete because I wanted one part of my family to be finished. Tessa found the missing part while helping inventory Eleanor's personal property. I was not present when she opened the storage unit. What I know came later from access records, file metadata, her emails, and the testimony she gave after my parents stopped protecting her. The unit stood in a climate-controlled warehouse outside Albany and remained in Eleanor's name. Arthur had an authorized access card as executor. Tessa received a temporary card because she volunteered to photograph furniture, sort papers, and prepare a list of items for the beneficiaries. Behind 2 boxes of tax files, she found a small wooden chest. Inside were Gavin's letters. The original shipping package Eleanor had taken from Constance. Copies of account statements, records connected to the sale of Eleanor's Western parcel, and paperwork tracing a cashier's check into the purchase of Tessa's first apartment. My sister was 26. She scanned the letters and financial papers on her laptop. The file dates later proved she spent more than an hour inside the unit after Arthur left. Tessa then emailed our mother. "I found Grandma's box. It has Gavin's letters and the apartment payment. If Meredith sees this, will they take my home?" Constance replied 11 minutes later. "Do not move anything out of the unit. Put it somewhere your father will not notice. We will deal with it after the estate closes. You did nothing wrong." Tessa answered, "I need you to promise I will not lose the apartment." Our mother wrote, "I promise. Meredith does not need to know about something that would only hurt her now." Tessa moved the box behind several containers of old holiday decorations and left it off the inventory. Arthur continued paying the storage fee because the remaining furniture had not been distributed. The unit stayed active, the box stayed hidden, and my sister signed the same release packet I did. At the time, Tessa was renovating the apartment Eleanor's money had helped buy. She posted photographs of hardwood floors, new cabinets, and a brass light fixture over the dining table. Under one picture, she wrote that she was proud to have built something entirely on her own. I congratulated her. That is the part that stayed with me. Not the apartment, not even the money. She had read Gavin's letters. She knew he had tried to reach me. Then she let me stand in her new kitchen, drink wine beneath that brass light, and tell her I was glad at least one of us had built the life she wanted. Years passed before I knew what sat behind the Christmas decorations in that storage unit. By early 2024, my health system began planning a regional emergency exercise with North Star Air Rescue. A winter storm the year before had exposed gaps in hospital evacuation procedures, and my department was assigned to review transport risks. The first planning meeting included 27 names. Gavin Rourke appeared near the bottom under flight operations. I could have reassigned the meeting. 3 people on my team were qualified to attend, and none would have questioned why a director delegated a preliminary session. For most of my adult life, I had treated avoidance as control. If I left first, stayed private, or refused to ask, no one could make a choice that surprised me. That morning, I printed the agenda and walked to the conference room myself. Voices carried through the closed door. Chairs shifted. Someone tested the speaker system, sending a brief burst of static into the hallway. My hand rested on the metal handle. When I opened the door, Gavin stood beside the projection screen, older than the man I remembered and immediately recognizable. His sentence stopped halfway through. 27 people looked between us. I did not wait for him to decide what the moment meant. Before this meeting begins, I said, I need to ask you one question. Gavin's hand lowered from the remote. Did you truly believe I ended our life together in an email? I asked. For several seconds, no one in the conference room moved. Gavin stood beside the projection screen with the remote still in his hand. The emergency exercise map glowed behind him, blue evacuation routes cutting across 3 counties, while 27 people waited for one of us to explain why a hospital risk director had just interrupted a professional meeting with a question about his 16-year-old breakup. His gaze stayed on mine. Yes, Gavin said. I believed you ended it. The answer came without hesitation, and that hurt more than uncertainty would have. A woman from County Emergency Management cleared her throat. Should we give you 2 a moment? No, I said. We have a meeting to run. Gavin placed the remote on the table. Meredith is right. We can discuss this afterward. For the next 90 minutes, we behaved like strangers who happened to know how the other one took coffee. I reviewed hospital transfer capacity. Gavin explained flight restrictions during freezing rain. When I challenged North Star's assumption that a rural facility could clear its helipad within 20 minutes, he did not soften his answer because of our history. 20 minutes is already generous, Gavin said. If the facility cannot guarantee a clear landing zone, we need an alternate site. Then the alternate site belongs in the primary plan, I replied. Not in an appendix. No one opens during an emergency. His mouth shifted, almost a smile. That sounds familiar. It should. I said the same thing about your Alaska budget. Several people laughed, assuming we were discussing an old professional disagreement. Gavin looked down at his notes. When the meeting ended, chairs scraped across the floor and conversations spilled into the hallway. I remained seated until the room emptied. Gavin packed his laptop slowly, giving me time to leave if I wanted. I did not. He closed the case and stood across the table from me. Gray touched his temples now, and a thin scar ran beneath the left side of his jaw. I remembered the surgeon telling Laurel the fracture had been complicated. I had never seen what healing left behind. Did you receive the email I sent from the hospital? I asked. The one saying you were still coming? Yes, I received it. And then, a second email came that night. I did not send a second email. Gavin's fingers tightened around the handle of his case. Your father mailed my ring the next morning. I did not give him the ring. He included a note saying you had asked him to return it. He took it from a safe in my parents' guest room. The fluorescent lights hummed above us. Somewhere beyond the door, a cart rattled down the hallway. Gavin pulled out a chair but did not sit. I need you to understand how this sounds. I understand exactly how it sounds. That is why it worked. He studied me for a moment, then settled into the chair. What did Laurel tell you? That you did not want to speak to me. I drove to the rehabilitation center, and the receptionist said the no-contact instruction came from you. It did. I wrote you a letter. I read it. My hand rested against the edge of the table. You never answered. I did answer. The room seemed to tilt, though nothing moved. Gavin opened his case again and removed a narrow folder. The corners had softened with age, and an old hospital label still clung to the front. I wrote 3 times, he said. The first letter was signed for at your parents' house. The second came back marked refused. The third package never came back, so I assumed you kept it. I never saw any of them. Gavin opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of certified mail receipts, a returned envelope, and the original printout of the email my mother had sent. The first contradiction was the date. The second was the language. I read the message once, then again more slowly. Some sentences sounded like me because they were built from real pieces of my life. The argument about Alaska. My fear of waiting for news after dangerous flights. Eleanor's dependence on me. Then I reached the line from my journal. Sometimes loving Gavin feels like standing beside a runway, watching the sky take everything I cannot control. My fingers stopped on the paper. I wrote this, I said. Gavin leaned forward. Then how can you say you did not send it? I wrote it in a private notebook, at my parents' house. He did not answer. My mother knew where I kept the notebook, I continued. She also knew the password to the family computer because she had set up the account. You used that account. Yes, but I was at the hospital when this was sent. Gavin pointed to the first page. The message came from your address. An address is not a person. His expression hardened. Do not speak to me as if I did nothing but glance at an email and disappear. I had your ring, your father's note. A request not to contact you. When I questioned it, Laurel asked whether you had sent the ring. I believed no one else could have taken it. That was reasonable. The anger in his face shifted. You agree? Gavin asked. I agree that the evidence was designed to make doubt look unreasonable. He leaned back. That does not erase what happened after. No, it does not. I had imagined this conversation in different forms for years. In some versions, Gavin apologized before I finished speaking. In others, I walked away after saying something sharp enough to balance the past. The man in front of me was not the 24-year-old I had lost, and I was no longer the woman who believed being right guaranteed a clean ending. I stopped calling because you asked me to stop, I said. But that was not the only reason. Gavin's gaze remained steady. I was proud, I continued. I had already driven there, written to you, and asked Laurel for an explanation. When the facility confirmed the request came from you, I decided I would not beg. I was proud too, he said. The admission landed quietly. Gavin closed the folder halfway, then left his hand resting on it. Your first email said you still planned to move. The later one reversed everything. Your letter said there had been another message. I started questioning it after the medication cleared. Then why did you not come to Albany? I wrote. When I did not answer, I saw your silence as an answer. You had already received one false answer. And I still had the ring. Neither of us raised our voice. We did not need to. 16 years sat between us, made of choices that had seemed defensible when we made them. Gavin looked toward the dark conference room window. By the time I was cleared to travel, I had convinced myself that showing up at your home would be disrespecting a boundary. And by then I had convinced myself that continuing to search for you would be humiliating. We were both very good at turning fear into principle. The sentence sounded too close to something Daniel had once told me. I looked down at the papers. Do you still have the original email file? I asked. Yes. Not just the printout? I saved the full message and copied the header before changing providers. That could show where it was sent from. It shows the network address used at the time. My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice even. And the real email? I saved that too. Then we compare them. Gavin frowned. For what purpose? To learn what happened. Meredith, this is not an internal review at your hospital. No, it is worse. An internal review usually starts with people admitting the documents exist. He closed the folder. Suppose you are right. Suppose someone used your account and mailed the ring. What changes? The truth. That is not what I asked. I understood the question beneath his words. Did I want him back? Did I want an apology? Was this an investigation, a reunion, or a way to punish two old people for a choice made long ago? I do not know what changes between us, I said. I know I will not let my parents keep the final version of what happened. Gavin nodded once. That I understand. We agreed to meet the following Saturday at a public library near Saratoga Springs, halfway between my apartment and North Star's office. Neutral ground mattered. Neither of us wanted memory doing more work than evidence. I arrived with my old laptop backup, a box of paper records, and the unsigned emergency contact form I had found in a file marked Alaska. Gavin brought the hospital folder, the ring package, and a flash drive containing both emails in their original format. We sat in a glass-walled study room while snow pressed against the windows. The real message had left my account at 4:14 in the afternoon. The header showed the hospital's public network. The false message had been sent at 10:12 that night. Its header pointed to the internet connection registered to my parents' house. Gavin stared at the screen. Could you have gone home? The drive was over 2 hours each way. I stayed near the medical center until after midnight. Can you prove it? Not yet. I searched my archived calendar and found the appointment notes from that week. No receipt. No parking record. Nothing strong enough to stand alone. Then Gavin placed the shipping envelope beside the laptop. The ring had been mailed the next morning using Pierce Infrastructure's corporate account. Arthur's employee code appeared beneath the tracking number. That proves your father sent it, Gavin said. It does not prove he stole it. No, I replied. But he told everyone I placed the ring in his hand. The first thing I had learned in risk work was that false statements often mattered more than missing documents. Honest people could forget details. Liars usually improved the story until it became too precise. We spent 4 hours comparing dates, wording, and envelopes. By late afternoon, a pattern had begun to form, but the motive remained hidden. Why would my parents risk everything to delay a move that was supposed to happen 6 weeks later? I packed the copies into separate folders. There is one person who might know. Gavin looked up. Your grandmother? She tried to tell me about a box before she died. What box? I thought she was confused. The words tasted worse once spoken. That evening, I called Tessa. She answered on the 4th ring, music and voices carrying behind her. Meredith, I am at dinner. I need to ask about Grandma's storage unit. The noise behind her seemed to recede. What storage unit? Tessa asked. You helped inventory it after the funeral. I helped with a lot of things. Grandma kept saying there was a box. She mentioned Dad and some letters. My sister did not respond. Tessa? A glass touched a table on her end of the line. I do not remember any box, she said. Her answer came too smoothly, but her breathing had changed. I had spent years reviewing interviews after accidents and financial failures. People rarely revealed the truth with the words they chose. They revealed it in the second before choosing them. Tessa knew exactly which box I meant. Tessa's breathing changed before she denied knowing about Eleanor's box, but a pause was not evidence. It was only a reason to keep looking. After the call ended, Gavin remained seated across from me in the library study room. Snow had thickened against the windows, turning the parking lot into a blur of headlights and white pavement. The old ring package lay between us beside my laptop. She knows something, Gavin said. I think she does. That is not the same answer. No, and I am not accusing her until I can prove it. Gavin closed the folder containing the emails. What happens now? The question covered more than my sister. For several weeks, we had exchanged documents, phone calls, and careful messages about the past. We had not discussed what any of it meant for the present. I gathered the papers into 2 stacks. Now we set rules. His eyebrows lifted. For the investigation? For us. The word sounded strange, but I left it on the table. I told him I would not disappear after a disagreement. He agreed not to send messages through Laurel or anyone else. Neither of us would use silence as punishment, and if one of us needed time, we would say how much time and when we would call again. No guessing, I said. No guessing, Gavin repeated. We are also not calling this a reunion. What are we calling it? Saturday. The corner of his mouth moved. That is very romantic. I am not trying to be romantic. I noticed. For the first 3 months, we met almost every Saturday. Sometimes we reviewed records. Other times we ate lunch, walked through bookstores, or drove nowhere in particular while the radio played quietly between us. We did not pretend the years apart had preserved us exactly as we had been. Gavin drank his coffee black now. I had learned to sleep without leaving a television on. His knees hurt in cold weather, and I had become the kind of woman who checked restaurant inspection records before ordering oysters. Some differences were harder. When Gavin grew quiet during an argument, my body prepared for abandonment before my mind caught up. When I asked a precise question, he sometimes heard an accusation hidden beneath it. One evening in June, he canceled dinner because an aircraft inspection ran late. His message contained the facts, an apology, and a suggestion for the following night. I still stared at the screen for 10 minutes before answering. Years earlier, I might have written that work was clearly more important and then ignored his next 3 calls. Instead, I typed what I meant. I know the delay is reasonable. I also know I am reacting to more than tonight. Call me when you leave the hangar. He called at 9:40. I almost did not send that message, I admitted. I almost added 5 more explanations. We are both doing very well. Exceptional work, Gavin said. No notes. It was awkward, sometimes exhausting, and far more honest than the effortless love I had once expected adulthood to provide. The investigation moved more slowly. I retained a forensic accountant named Lillian Shaw, who had spent 20 years tracing money through family businesses, estates, and divorces. She wore plain gray suits, spoke without drama, and refused to call a theory a fact merely because it made sense. Among the probate papers I had saved were 4 monthly bank statements Eleanor had attached to a written inquiry before her second stroke. Arthur's final accounting had treated the care money as gradually depleted through legitimate expenses. The statements showed something else. One transfer had moved a large sum from Eleanor's care account into the joint account belonging to Arthur and Constance. Arthur had signed the instruction as Eleanor's financial agent. The following day, 2 payments left the joint account. One cashier's check went to satisfy a debt connected to Arthur's failed property investment. A second check, signed by Constance, went to an escrow company. Lillian placed copies side by side on the conference table. "The timing supports tracing," she said. "It does not complete it." "The amounts nearly match," I replied. "Nearly is not exactly. Money entered an account that may have contained other funds. We need the escrow file, the source of funds record, and preferably the bank's image of the deposited check." The escrow company handled Tessa's apartment. "That is your theory." "Public property records show she closed 2 days later." Lillian folded her hands. "That makes it a strong theory." Gavin sat beside me but did not interrupt. I had asked him to attend because the old ring package and email headers were part of the timeline, not because I needed him to argue my case. Lillian tapped Arthur's transfer instruction. "This proves your father moved the money while acting under the power of attorney. It does not yet prove the money was unauthorized. Eleanor created the account for her care. Purpose matters, but so do the terms. We need the account agreement, the power of attorney, and evidence showing whether your grandmother approved this transfer." She questioned why the money was missing. "That helps. It still does not permit me to skip the missing steps." After the meeting, Gavin and I sat in my car beneath a hard spring rain. "You hate her," he said. "I hired her because she refuses to agree with me." That was not a denial. "I respect her deeply and hope she steps in a puddle." Gavin laughed, then grew quiet. "What?" I asked. "I need to know something before this goes further." I waited. "Am I here because you want me in your life, or because I am the witness who proves your parents lied?" The rain beat against the roof. Water raced down the windshield, dividing the parking lot into shifting pieces. "You are both," I said. His jaw tightened. That was not the whole answer. I turned toward him. "You are part of what happened, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But I do not spend Saturdays with an email header. I do not call a shipping receipt when I cannot sleep." "You might. You have always liked paperwork." "I do, but it is terrible company." His expression softened, though the question remained. "I do not want the man I lost at 22, I said. "I do not know him anymore. I want to know the man sitting in my car who thinks safety reports should be written in a font no human being can read. It is a standard font. It is an act of hostility." Gavin looked through the rain-streaked glass. "My marriage ended because Claire and I became very polite strangers. We worked late, divided chores, paid bills, and avoided asking whether either of us was happy." "Did you love her?" "Yes." The answer pinched, but I had asked for honesty. "She deserved more than the part of me that was not busy," he continued. "So did I. By the time we admitted it, there was nothing left to fight over." I told him about Samuel and the drawer, about Daniel and the folder of reasons. I admitted that whenever someone offered help, I searched for the hidden price. "My parents made dependence expensive," I said. "I decided never to owe anyone enough to hurt me." "And how has that worked?" "I have excellent credit." Gavin nodded solemnly. "That is almost the same as happiness." By autumn, our Saturdays became Wednesdays too. Then, ordinary Tuesdays, when nothing had gone wrong and no document needed reviewing. The paper trail continued to widen. Public property records confirmed that Tessa had purchased her Albany apartment within days of the transfer from Eleanor's account. The recorded purchase price matched the loan documents available through the county clerk, but public records did not reveal the exact source of her down payment. Tessa had sold the apartment in 2023. The deed showed the sale, date, and buyer, nothing more. We could not see where the proceeds went, how much remained after the mortgage, or whether she still held any of it. Lillian refused to speculate. "Until we obtain closing records or account statements, the proceeds are private," she said. "Do not accuse your sister of holding money we cannot trace." I followed that advice. Following good advice did not make waiting easier. At Christmas, Constance asked whether my fiancé would attend dinner. You said he travels, she added, though you have never told us where. He is working. Arthur poured himself another glass of wine. Convenient. Tessa studied the new habits I had developed since reconnecting with Gavin. The way I checked my phone and smiled. The weekends. I declined family invitations without explanation. The ring was not on my hand yet, but she sensed something had shifted. You could show us a picture, she said. I could. Then why do you act as if he is classified information? Because every detail I give this family becomes something I later have to defend. Mom's fork stopped above her plate. That is a cruel thing to say. It was not intended to be kind. I left before dessert. Gavin proposed in March beside a lake north of Saratoga, where winter had not fully released the shore. Snow remained beneath the trees, but the path had turned to mud, and both of us ruined our shoes before reaching the bench he had chosen. He poured coffee from a thermos and handed me a paper cup. This is either a proposal or the least comfortable picnic in New York, I said. It may be both. The ring he removed from his coat was new. A simple oval diamond set low against a smooth band. Chosen because I worked with my hands and disliked jewelry that caught on everything. The old sapphire remained sealed with the shipping envelope in secure document storage. Neither of us wanted the object used to separate us. Turned into a symbol of our future. I cannot promise nothing will frighten me, Gavin said. I can promise I will tell you before fear turns into a decision. Mud darkened the knees of his trousers, and cold wind pushed across the lake. I cannot promise I will ask for help gracefully, I replied. But I will ask before deciding no one would give it. He held the ring between us. Is that a yes? It is the longest yes you will ever receive. When I told my family I was engaged, I did not give them Gavin's name. Part of the decision was protection. We were still collecting records, and I did not want Arthur or Constance contacting him before we understood what they had done. Part of it was mine. I wanted to choose when they saw him. After years of having my words, mail, and choices handled for me, controlling one revelation felt almost fair. Several days later, Lillian called about Tessa's apartment. I found the escrow company named on the county filing, she said. They still exist, but they will not release the closing file without authorization or legal process. Could Tessa request it? As the buyer, yes. She may already have a copy. I called my sister that evening. Tessa answered from her car. A turn signal clicked steadily behind her voice. I need the closing file from your old apartment, I said. Why? I am reviewing Grandma's estate accounting. What does my apartment have to do with Grandma? That is what I am trying to determine. The clicking stopped. I do not have those papers anymore, she said. You may be able to request them from the escrow company. Meredith, this is getting strange. I asked for a file, Tessa. I have not accused you of anything. Her next breath came slowly through the phone. You are not going to find what you think you will, she said. What do you think I am looking for? Another car horn sounded somewhere near her. Then my sister asked the question that changed the investigation. You are asking about Grandma's wooden box, aren't you? I had never told Tessa the box was wooden. Until that moment, I had not known it was. The turn signal clicked twice before Tessa answered my question. What wooden box? She asked. You tell me. I said Grandma's box. You are the one calling it wooden. No, Tessa. You said, you're asking about Grandma's wooden box, aren't you? I never described it. Traffic moved around her car, tires hissing against wet pavement. My sister took a breath, then released it slowly. I must have seen it when we cleared the storage unit, she said. You told me you did not remember any box. I did not remember until you kept pushing. Where is it? I don't know. Who took it? I said I don't know. The words came faster now, each one crowding the next. I had heard that rhythm before. Tessa used it whenever she hoped speed would make questions sound unreasonable. I moved to my desk and opened a blank document. You have 48 hours. For what? To meet with me and my attorney, explain what you found, and give written consent for us to inspect Grandma's storage unit. Her voice sharpened. You cannot threaten me. I am not threatening you. I am explaining what happens next. What happens next? My attorney petitions for a compulsory accounting and asks the court to order a supplemental inventory of Grandma's personal papers. Your name appears on the storage access records, so you will be asked what you removed, what you saw, and why none of it appeared on the estate inventory. I did not remove anything. That is the first useful answer you have given me. Tessa went silent. If you meet voluntarily, I continued, you control whether you tell the truth before a judge asks. If you refuse, I proceed without your cooperation. Does Mom know you are doing this? No? Dad? No. A car horn sounded near her. You are trying to blow up the family. I asked about a box. You know what I mean. I know what you are afraid of. Those are not the same thing. Tessa ended the call without agreeing, but 20 minutes later, a text appeared. Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, send the address. I forwarded the message to my attorney, Nora Bell, then wrote down everything I remembered from the call while the language was still fresh. Nora had warned me not to record conversations without discussing the circumstances first. A dated memo would not replace evidence, but it would preserve what I had heard and what I had said. At the top of the page, I typed one sentence. Tessa knew the box was wooden before I described it. The following afternoon, my sister arrived at Nora's office 14 minutes late. Tessa wore a cream coat over a pale blue dress, the kind of outfit that looked effortless after an hour of planning. Her engagement ring flashed as she set her handbag on the conference table. She had brought no documents. Nora sat at one end of the room with a legal pad. I sat across from Tessa and left the chair beside me empty. My sister glanced at Nora. Is she going to take notes on everything I say? Yes, I replied. I thought this was a conversation between sisters. You denied the box existed yesterday. Tessa's eyes filled immediately. The tears were real. That did not make the explanation behind them true. I was 17 when all this started, she said. I had nothing to do with Gavin's accident or the emails or the ring. I agree. The answer stopped her. You do? Tessa asked. You were 17. I do not blame you for what Mom and Dad did in 2008. Her shoulders lowered, but only for a moment. How old were you when you found the box? I asked. Tessa looked toward the window. Tessa, 26. And how old were you when you scanned the letters? Her head turned back sharply. How do you know I scanned anything? I did not. You just told me. The room went quiet except for the low hum of the air vent. Nora's pen moved across the legal pad. Tessa pressed both palms against the table. I scanned them because I was scared Dad would destroy them. Why would you think that? Because of what was inside. Say it. Her lower lip trembled. Letters from Gavin. Bank statements. Papers about the apartment. My fingertips rested against the smooth wood. You read the letters? Yes. All of them? Yes. The word barely carried across the table. You knew he had written to me after the accident. Tessa wiped beneath one eye with the side of her finger. Mom said you had already moved on. What did the letters say? That he thought you sent the email? That he wanted you to contact him if the ring had not been returned by choice? And you believed Mom? I did not know what to believe. You knew I had never seen the letters. She said telling you would reopen something you had spent years getting over. I watched my sister's hand close around the strap of her handbag. What did you think would happen to your apartment? Her gaze dropped. That is what you asked, Mom, wasn't it? I continued. Whether you would lose the apartment if I found the records. Tessa turned toward Nora. Do I need my own lawyer? You are free to consult one, Nora said. This meeting is voluntary. Meredith is asking for access to property records and papers left jointly to the two of you. No one is requiring you to answer further today. Tessa looked back at me. Would you have taken my home? I would have asked where the money came from. That is not an answer. It is the only honest answer I can give without seeing the records. Her chair scraped softly as she shifted. I had just finished renovating. I had loans. I had put everything into that apartment. Grandma put something into it too. I did not ask Dad to take her money. But once you knew, you asked Mom to make sure you could keep what it bought. Tessa covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook, and for a moment she looked much younger than 34. I remembered braiding her hair before school, teaching her to parallel park, and driving 2 hours to collect her when she broke up with her first serious boyfriend. Those memories did not disappear. They simply stopped serving as excuses. I love you, Tessa said through her hands. I believe you. She lowered them. I also believe you chose the apartment. Tessa's face tightened. You make everything sound so simple. No, simple would have been finding the box and handing it to me. You had 8 years to choose differently. Nora slid a 2-page consent form across the table. The storage lease remained in Eleanor's name because the estate had never fully distributed the furniture inside. Years earlier, Eleanor had added both Tessa and me as authorized contacts so either of us could help move family items. Arthur held the executor's management key, but the will left Eleanor's personal papers jointly to her 2 granddaughters. Tessa did not have the right to hide shared papers from me. I did not have the right to enter, remove everything, and declare it mine. Her written consent allowed Nora, a neutral inventory professional, and me to inspect the unit with Tessa present. It also required that original documents remain secured until ownership and relevance were determined. Tessa read the form twice. If I sign this, you cannot post anything online, she said. I have no intention of posting anything. You cannot send it to Dean. I am giving you the opportunity to tell Dean yourself. Her eyes lifted. Why does he need to know? Because you are about to marry him while hiding a financial claim tied to property you sold. There is no claim yet. Then the truth should be easy to tell. Tessa picked up the pen. Her signature leaned uphill, larger than usual. We entered the storage unit 3 days later. Gavin did not come. He had offered to wait nearby, but the box involved Eleanor's estate and my sister's cooperation. Bringing him inside would have turned an inventory into a confrontation. The facility manager checked our identification and compared it with the lease records. Tessa surrendered the temporary access code she had retained from the estate inventory. Nora hired Janet Hale, a records specialist who handled disputed household and business archives. Janet started a continuous video at the hallway entrance. She stated the date, time, unit number, and names of everyone present. Each of us confirmed on camera that the lock showed no visible damage before the manager opened it. Cold, dry air carried the smell of cardboard and old fabric. Furniture stood beneath white covers along one wall. Plastic containers were stacked by season, with Christmas decorations nearest the back. Tessa stopped just inside. Where? Janet asked. My sister pointed toward 3 green bins marked ornaments. The boxes had to be photographed before anyone moved them. Janet numbered each container, recorded its position, then asked the facility manager to help shift the stack. A wooden chest sat behind them beneath a folded tablecloth. It was smaller than I expected. Dark oak brass latch, one corner scratched pale where it had rubbed against the concrete wall. A strip of yellowed tape crossed the lid. Janet moved the camera closer. Eleanor's handwriting remained visible beneath the plastic. Give this to Meredith. Arthur and Constance lied about Gavin. Ask about the land money. The room narrowed around those words. I kept my hands at my sides. Janet placed the chest on a clean folding table, photographed every surface, and cut the old tape without disturbing the note. Nora watched the chain of custody sheet while each item received a number. 3 letters lay at the top. The first envelope carried the certified mail label and Constance's signature. The second had been marked, refused in my mother's handwriting. The padded package remained sealed, its corners softened by years in Eleanor's dresser, and then the storage unit. Beneath them sat the original closing statement from the sale of Eleanor's western parcel. Account statements, copies of transfer instructions, and a bank image of the cashier's check sent to the escrow company that handled Tessa's apartment. There was also a photocopy of the envelope Arthur had used to mail Gavin's ring. Not the ring itself. The original had remained with Gavin all those years. Eleanor had circled Pierce Infrastructure's account number and written beside it, Arthur sent this. Meredith was at the hospital. Janet read each document number aloud while Nora entered it on the inventory. Nothing left the table until it had been photographed, placed in an archival sleeve, and logged. Only after the letters were preserved did Nora ask whether I wanted a working copy. I nodded. The first letter was brief. Gavin asked whether returning the ring had truly been my choice and said he would not come to Albany if I wanted distance. The second was more direct. He referred to the letter I had left at the rehabilitation center and asked why it contradicted the email. The sealed package contained a copy of my real message from the hospital, his account of receiving the false one, and a handwritten note. If your father returned the ring without your permission, call me. I will wait for the truth. but I cannot keep chasing an answer through people who speak for you." I lowered the paper before the words blurred. Tessa stood several feet away, rubbing her thumb over the side of her engagement ring. "You read this in 2017, I said. "Yes. And then you hid it again. Mom told me you were happy. Were you?" Her hands stopped moving. The question was not about me. Tessa understood that. "I thought I was building something," she said. "The apartment, my career, a life that did not depend on anyone. It depended on Grandma. I did not know when Dad bought it. But you knew when you sold it." Tessa looked toward Nora. "Mom pressured me. I have emails." "Then provide them." My sister hesitated before taking out her phone. She opened an old account, searched Constance's name, and found the thread from the week she discovered the box. Tessa forwarded the entire conversation to Nora and me without editing the chain. Nora confirmed receipt, saved a read-only copy, and asked Tessa to sign an acknowledgement, preserving the original cloud folder and associated account data. The emails showed Constance telling Tessa not to move the box and promising she would not lose the apartment. They also showed Tessa's reply, "Do not tell Meredith until you guarantee I will not lose my home. If Dad ever tries to blame me, I need copies of everything." I read the sentence twice. "You kept the scans as insurance," I said. Tessa folded her arms. "Can you blame me?" "Yes." Her eyes widened. "You knew Mom and Dad could turn on you," I continued. "That means you knew the documents were true enough to protect you. You kept them for the day you might need to save yourself, but not for any day I needed the truth." Tessa began crying again, more quietly this time. Janet finished sealing the original documents in numbered evidence bags. Nora arranged secure storage through her office and gave each of us a copy of the completed log. The facility manager signed the final line, confirming the chest had been found inside the unit. Outside, afternoon heat rose from the asphalt. Tessa stood beside her car with both hands wrapped around her keys. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "Tell Dean." Her face changed. "Before the engagement party? Before you marry him. He will think I stole from Grandma. Tell him exactly what happened and let him decide what he thinks. You know his family has money in the wedding? This is not about their deposits. It is easy for you to say that. You already have Gavin." The sentence struck harder than she intended. I could see it in the way her mouth opened afterward. "I had Gavin at 22, I said. You helped keep me from knowing that." I said I was sorry. "No, you said you were afraid. What is the difference? Fear explains a choice. It does not repair it." I gave her 2 requests. She would tell Dean the truth, and she would cooperate with correcting Eleanor's estate accounting. I did not demand a public confession or ask her to cancel the engagement. I gave her until the end of August to speak to him privately. Tessa nodded. "I will." For several weeks, she answered Nora's emails and provided copies of old apartment records she still possessed. She confirmed the escrow company and the bank that issued the cashier's check. Her cooperation was incomplete, but it was more than silence. Then the formal engagement invitation arrived. Heavy cream paper, gold lettering, Cedar Vale Lodge, September 20th. A note in Tessa's handwriting lay beneath it. "I am trying to fix things, but please do not bring Gavin or old family drama into the happiest weekend of my life. Dean does not need every painful detail before we are married." I placed the note beside the copies of her emails. She had not told him. 2 days later, Nora received a letter from Arthur's attorney demanding the return of all documents removed from the storage unit. The letter accused me of pressuring Tessa, interfering with Arthur's work as executor, and threatening to expose private family matters. Nora responded with the inventory video, Tessa's written consent, the chain of custody log, and noticed that the papers were being preserved for an estate accounting proceeding. Nothing had been published. Nothing had been handed to the press or Gavin. The originals remained secured. Arthur answered with a sworn declaration. He admitted mailing the ring but claimed I had voluntarily returned it. He said Constance handled all communication with Gavin and that he had relied on his wife's account of my wishes. He placed the financial transfers in a separate category, calling them authorized family loans that Eleanor had approved verbally. In 6 pages, my father built a version of the past where every damaging act belonged to someone else. That evening, my mother called from a number I did not recognize. "I read your father's declaration," Constance said. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of the careful warmth she usually used with me. "He is going to blame all of it on me. You helped him. That does not mean I did what he says. What did you do? Mom breathed into the phone. I need to tell you in person, she said. And Meredith, you must come alone. My mother arrived at my apartment the next evening carrying a glass casserole dish wrapped in a yellow towel. The smell reached me before she spoke. Chicken, thyme, butter, and the crushed crackers she used to scatter across the top when Tessa and I were children. Constance had made that casserole after every fever, failed exam, and breakup she believed could be fixed with enough salt. May I come in? She asked. You said I had to come alone. I changed my mind. That usually means you want control of the room. Her fingers tightened beneath the dish, but she kept her smile. I brought dinner, Meredith. I stepped aside. Gavin was not there. Neither was Nora. I had told both of them about the call, and Nora had advised me to listen without bargaining, promising, or handing over documents. She also reminded me that a private confession could be denied the moment Constance walked out. The original papers remained in secure storage. My phone stayed face down on the counter. I did not record the conversation. Mom placed the casserole on my kitchen island and began opening cabinets as if she still knew where everything belonged. Plates? She asked. Beside the refrigerator. You always used to keep them near the sink. I have lived here for 6 years. Constance found the plates and set 2 beside the dish. That was not criticism. No, it was practice. She stopped with the serving spoon halfway into the casserole. Must every sentence be a test? I did not invite you here for dinner. The spoon struck the edge of the dish with a dull click. For a moment, neither of us moved. Rain whispered against the windows, and the refrigerator motor started behind me. Mom pulled out a stool and sat. I sent the email, she said. There were confessions that exploded. This one landed softly, wrapped in the smell of childhood food and the sound of water moving through the gutters. I remained standing. Which email? Her eyes narrowed. You know which one. I want you to say it clearly. Constance folded her hands on the counter. I sent the message to Gavin after his accident. The one ending the engagement. From my account. Yes. Using words from my journal. Her mouth tightened. I should not have read that. That is not an answer. Yes, she said. I used the line from your journal. The room felt too warm. I turned off the burner beneath the kettle, even though I had not switched it on. Why? Mom looked toward the windows. Because you could not see what your life would become. What life? Waiting for phone calls in the middle of the night, watching weather reports, raising children alone every time he flew into a storm. One day, someone would appear at your door and tell you he was not coming home. Her voice did not shake. That was the frightening part. She had repeated this reasoning often enough to herself that it had worn smooth. Gavin was 24, she continued. He thought danger made him noble. You thought loving him made you brave. He flew rescue aircraft. He nearly died during training. So you chose for me. I protected you. You took my ring from a safe, wrote in my name, and told an injured man never to contact me. Constance's gaze returned to mine. You were going to leave before Eleanor could manage safely. I had hired care. Strangers. Professionals. She wanted family. Grandma asked me to review her account and arrange professional help. Mom pressed her lips together. I pulled out the stool across from her but did not sit. Why did you send the email the night before I was supposed to meet Eleanor's attorney? Her eyes flicked toward the casserole. There it was. Not surprise. Calculation. I do not remember the exact date, she said. You remembered enough to send it while I was at the hospital. Arthur was handling the finances. That is not what I asked. Constance reached for the serving spoon again. This food will be ruined. Let it. The spoon dropped onto the towel. I sat across from her. Why did you stop me from seeing the account statements? Your father said he needed time. Time for what? Mom's thumb rubbed the side of her wedding band. Once. Twice. Then again. He had put money into an investment, she said. A temporary investment. Eleanor's money. He expected to replace it. How much? I did not know at first. When did you know? After the accident. The answer came too quickly. I leaned back. You knew before the email. Constance looked at me, and the silence confirmed what her mouth would not. Arthur said he could fix it, she said at last. He needed a few months. If you left and hired that agency, The attorney would ask for records, and everything would come apart. The casserole smell turned sour in the back of my throat. So the danger was not Gavin's job. It was both. No, Gavin's job gave you a story you could live with. The money gave you a deadline. Mom stood so suddenly the stool legs scraped across the floor. Do not make your father's mistake mine. You wrote the email. He told me we only needed to delay you. You used my journal. He mailed the ring before I knew what he planned to put in the package. You let me believe Gavin rejected me for 16 years. Constance walked to the window and crossed her arms. By the time I understood he had kept writing, you had moved out, you had work, you were building a life. A life I built around a lie. What would telling you have changed after 5 years? After 10? He married someone else. You did not get to decide when the truth became too old to matter. Mom turned. Her face had hardened, the softness gone. You think everything is clean when written on paper? She said. It was not clean. Eleanor needed care. Your father was drowning in debt. Tessa had college applications. You were the only person in the family who could handle pressure without falling apart. The old sentence, dressed in praise. You were strong, Constance continued. Tessa was not. What happened when I was strong? You managed. What happened when Tessa was weak? We helped her. And what happened when Dad stole? He promised to repay it. The word stole hung between us. Constance heard it too. Her chin lifted, but she did not correct me. I asked the second question. Why did you sign the check to the escrow company? Her face changed. Lillian had traced the money as far as the joint account. Arthur signed the transfer out of Eleanor's care account. The following day, a cashier's check went from the joint account to the escrow company handling Tessa's apartment. The check bore Constance Whitlock's signature. Mom returned to the island but did not sit. Arthur told me it was family money. The joint account contained Eleanor's transfer. I did not see the transfer instruction. You signed the check 1 day later. Tessa needed the down payment. She was 17. It was held until she was ready to buy. So you knew the money was being set aside for her. I knew your father wanted both daughters secure. One daughter got an apartment. The other got a forged breakup. Constance flinched. The reaction lasted less than a second, but I saw it. I loved you both, she said. You loved us according to what we could do for you. That is vicious. It is accurate. Mom gathered the towel around the casserole dish, though neither of us had eaten. I asked my final question before she could leave. Why did you keep lying after Grandma died? Her hand stopped. You could have given me the letters, I said. The money was already gone. Gavin had married. I had moved out. What were you protecting then? Constance stared at the dish. Arthur said the estate would be settled quietly, she replied. He said reopening everything would cost more than it recovered. That explains the money. What about the letters? Tessa had found them. I know. She was frightened. So you protected her again. Her apartment was her only real asset. And my life was expendable. No mother thinks that way. You did not have to think it. You only had to keep choosing it. Mom lifted the dish. Your father started this. You joined him. He had already moved the money before I understood the full amount. You sent the email before he mailed the ring. He was going to destroy this family. You helped him preserve the part that served you. The yellow towel slipped from one corner of the dish. Constance caught it before the glass struck the counter. Arthur is preparing to say, I acted alone, she said. The sentence was not an apology. It was the reason she had come. You want me to protect you from Dad. I want the truth stated correctly. You want your portion reduced. Her eyes sharpened. He controlled the accounts. And you controlled me. Mom stood near the door for several seconds. If you force this into court, everything becomes public. Court records are not automatically a family newsletter. Malcolm will learn about the company account. He should. Your father could lose his position. That depends on what he disclosed and what company property he used. You sound pleased. I sound prepared. Constance left the casserole on my counter. After the door closed, I did not touch the food. I sat at the island and wrote down the conversation while each sentence remained clear. The time she arrived. The dish she carried. Her admission that she sent the email. Her knowledge of Arthur's promise to replace the money before I left. Her acknowledgement that she signed the escrow check after the funds entered the joint account. At the bottom, I added what she had not admitted. She had not said Arthur ordered her to write the email. She had said he needed time. She had not claimed she believed the money belonged to Tessa. She had said Tessa needed it. Nora called the next morning. "The memo helps preserve your recollection," she said. "It is not a recorded confession, and Constance may deny parts of it." "I know. The documents still carry the case." Her statement connects motive and timing. "But we do not build everything on what she said in your kitchen." Nora had already prepared a petition asking the surrogate's court to compel a fuller accounting of Arthur's actions as executor and to address the unresolved property records. She did not promise the judge would grant every request. She did not say the estate had magically reopened because we found a box. "We have enough to ask questions under process," she said. "That is different from having every answer." Arthur's lawyer received the filing that afternoon. By the following week, the first crack inside my family widened. I learned the details months later through produced text messages, emails, and sworn testimony. Constance contacted Tessa after leaving my apartment and accused her of preserving the scanned records instead of destroying them. Tessa answered that she kept copies because neither parent could be trusted. Arthur discovered the exchange and told Constance she had admitted too much. He began drafting a new statement claiming the breakup email had been her independent decision and that he had mailed the ring only after she assured him I wanted it returned. Constance responded that Arthur had chosen the timing, provided Gavin's rehabilitation address, and used his office account to send the package. Each tried to move one step away from the center. Instead, they left footprints. While they turned on one another, Nora sent a narrow preservation request to Pierce Infrastructure. She asked the company to retain records connected to Arthur's old shipping account, expense classifications, and annual officer certifications. Pierce required senior officers to disclose disputes involving misuse of entrusted funds and any personal use of company systems that could raise an integrity concern. The policy did not mean Arthur would automatically lose his job. It meant his later answers could be compared with what he had certified. Malcolm did not see our evidence at that stage. The request went through corporate counsel, not through a private conversation at a dinner table. I did not want my father punished by rumor. I wanted the documents preserved before he learned which questions were coming. Lillian prepared a tracing page for Nora. The heading stated that the analysis was preliminary and subject to a formal accounting. It showed Arthur's transfer from Eleanor's care account, the deposit into my parents' joint account, and the escrow check Constance signed the next day. Between those two transactions sat the timestamp of the false email. Paper could not prove who placed her hands on the keyboard. My mother had already supplied that part. The week before Tessa's engagement dinner, Gavin met me at Cedar Vale Lodge after a North Star planning session. His team had arranged the emergency exercise months earlier, and the lodge's licensed landing site was included in the approved route. The aircraft belonged to the contracted aviation operator supporting the exercise, not to Gavin, and the flight would have occurred whether I attended Tessa's party or not. "My crew debrief ends during dinner," he said as we walked past the terrace. "I can stay in the conference wing until you text. You do not need to hide." "I am not hiding. I am asking what you want." I looked through the windows at the empty dining room where staff were arranging tables. "Come in when your work is finished," I said. "Not as evidence, as my fiancé." Gavin nodded. "That I can do." Nora and I agreed that the engagement dinner would not become a legal ambush. No service of papers, no announcement about the estate, no presentation to the guests. The original evidence stayed secured. I carried only 3 copies in my document case: the preliminary tracing page, the old shipping envelope, and the email thread Tessa had voluntarily forwarded after the storage inspection. They were insurance against a public lie, nothing more. The night before the party, Tessa called. Her voice sounded bright, almost relieved. I told Dean. I stepped away from my desk. "Everything?" "Enough." "What does that mean?" "He knows there were questions about Grandma's account and that I found some family papers." "Does he know you hid Gavin's letters?" A pause followed. "He knows the situation was complicated." "That is not what I asked." "Dean understands, Meredith. He forgave me." "Did you tell him the apartment down payment may have come from Grandma's care money?" "I told him Dad handled the finances." "And your choice 8 years later?" "You are determined to ruin this weekend. I am asking whether your fiancé knows who he is marrying." Tessa's voice dropped. "He knows me better than you do." The call ended soon after. 10 minutes later, a message arrived from an unfamiliar number. "This is Dean Holloway. Tessa gave me your number because I asked for it. She says you are threatening to expose your parents unless they give you money from your grandmother's estate. I would like to hear your side before tomorrow." I read it twice. Tessa had not confessed. She had built a new lie and placed me inside it. Dean's message arrived the night before the engagement dinner, asking whether I was threatening my parents for money. I did not answer with an accusation. I sent one sentence. "I am not asking anyone to give me money. I am asking for an accurate accounting of funds that belong to Eleanor Whitlock, and Tessa has documents you should review before you marry her." Dean replied 6 minutes later. "She says the documents are old misunderstandings and that you are using them because your parents prefer her." I looked at the screen until the words stopped surprising me. "Then ask her to show you the emails she voluntarily gave my attorney," I wrote. "Do not take my word for anything." Dean did not respond again that night. By the time Gavin crossed the dining room at Cedarvale Lodge the following evening, kissed my hand, and placed the old ring package beside my father's champagne glass, Dean had already spent nearly a day wondering which woman had lied to him. Arthur's fingers remained wrapped around his glass. "You suffered a serious head injury," Dad said to Gavin. "Memory becomes unreliable after something like that." Gavin did not raise his voice. "The postmark did not suffer a concussion." Dad's expression hardened. "The shipping envelope, your handwriting, and my family's ring were all delivered together," Gavin continued. "None of those facts depend on my memory." Malcolm Pierce remained standing beside his chair. "Arthur." This would be a good moment to stop. My father looked around the table, measuring the room. He had spent decades learning which version of himself each audience expected. At work, he was controlled. At home, unquestioned. In public, generous enough to make disagreement look ungrateful. "This is a private family misunderstanding," Arthur said. "Gavin has arrived without context and allowed Meredith to turn old pain into theater." "I did not know he was bringing the envelope," I said. That was true. Gavin had told me he would keep the original secure. He had changed his mind only after hearing Dad say I had voluntarily returned the ring. Arthur gave me a look that had once been enough to end conversations. "You always find a technical distinction. A distinction between true and false is useful." Mom pushed back her chair. "Not here, Meredith. Whatever grievances you believe you have, this is Tessa's engagement." "I agree." I closed the blue ring box and handed it back to Gavin. "We came to congratulate Tessa and Dean," I said. "We will do that, then leave." The room released a fraction of its tension. Dean's mother lowered her napkin. A server near the wall resumed pouring water. Tessa could have let us go. Instead, she stood. The movement knocked her chair against the table, sending a sharp wooden crack through the dining room. "No," my sister said. "You do not get to walk in here after hiding him for a year, humiliate our parents, and then act dignified." Dean turned toward her. "Tessa." "She planned this," Tessa continued, her voice carried beyond our table. "She kept Gavin's secret because she wanted everyone looking at her tonight." I picked up my document case. "Meredith has been threatening us over Grandma's estate," Tessa told the guests nearest us. "She says she will take my old apartment money and drag Dad's name through court unless everyone admits she was mistreated." Dean's face changed. "What apartment money?" Tessa looked at him. The question landed harder than anything I could have said. "You told me this was about missing letters," Dean said. "You said there was no real financial claim." "There is not," Tessa replied. "Meredith found a few old statements and built a story around them." Dean glanced at me. "Do you have the statements?" "Yes." "Do they show what she says they show?" "They show enough to require a formal accounting. They are not a court ruling." Tessa laughed, though no humor reached the sound. "Listen to her. She makes everything sound official so people will be afraid to question her." "I invited you to tell Dean privately," I said. "I told him what mattered." "You told him I was demanding money." "You are. I am asking the estate to recover whatever can be traced." "I have not asked for a personal payment to me." Tessa turned toward the room. "She wants to take my home because Mom and Dad helped me with a down payment years ago." Dean lowered his voice. "You told me you bought that apartment from your own savings." My sister's hand moved to her ring. I could have stopped there. The lie had already opened beneath her. Instead, Constance stepped in. Arthur and I gave both daughters help when we could, Mom said. There was nothing improper about supporting Tessa. Nora's instructions ran through my mind. Correct only statements the documents could address. Do not argue motives. Do not announce conclusions. I removed the first copy from my case and placed it in front of Dean. This is a preliminary tracing prepared by a forensic accountant, I said. It is not a judgment, and it does not establish the final amount owed. Dean bent over the page. The chart contained 4 boxes. Eleanor's care account, my parents' joint account, an escrow company, Tessa's apartment closing. Dates and check references connected them. Tessa reached for the paper, but Dean placed his palm over the top. Let me read it, he said. Dad handled Grandma's money, Tessa replied. I did not know where the gift came from. You may not have known when you bought the apartment, I said. Her eyes snapped toward mine. But you knew when you found Eleanor's box in 2017. Dean looked up. What box? Tessa's face lost what little color remained. I opened the case again and removed the email thread she had voluntarily forwarded after our storage inspection. You scanned the letters and financial papers, I said. Then you asked Mom whether you would lose the apartment if I found out. You pressured me into forwarding those messages. Nora explained that the meeting was voluntary. You asked whether you needed a lawyer, and she told you that you were free to consult one before continuing. Mom rose from her chair. Tessa was terrified. I told her to wait because Arthur needed time to correct the records. My father turned slowly toward her. Constance stopped speaking. You told her what? Arthur asked. Mom's hand tightened around the table edge. You said you were replacing the money. That had nothing to do with the letters. You told me Meredith could not leave until the account was restored. Arthur's glass struck the table. Do not rewrite this because you are frightened. Dean pushed the tracing page aside and read the printed email thread. Tessa reached for his sleeve. My mother was pressuring me. He moved his arm before she touched him. The gesture was small, but Tessa stared at the empty space between them. Did you know Gavin had written to Meredith? Dean asked. I found the letters years later. That was not my question. Tessa swallowed. Yes. How long did you know? 8 years. Dean closed his eyes. No one at the neighboring tables pretended not to listen anymore. But there was no applause, no delighted crowd waiting for revenge. Only people trapped inside the silence that follows a truth too ugly for celebration. I was scared, Tessa said. I thought I would lose everything. Dean removed his engagement ring from her finger carefully. He did not throw it or raise his voice. He placed it beside her untouched champagne. I need you to give mine back, he said. Tessa covered the ring with her hand. Dean, please. I asked you last night whether there was more. You looked at me and said no. We can talk upstairs. I am leaving the room. Dean stood and offered his mother a hand. His parents followed without addressing anyone at our table. Tessa's shoulders folded inward. You did this, she said to me. No, I gave you weeks to tell him. You knew he would leave. I knew he deserved the choice you denied Gavin and me. Arthur moved toward the document case. Give me those papers. They are copies. You had no right to bring them here. I did not show them until Tessa accused me of extortion. Dad pointed at Constance. She sent the email. I did not write a word of it. Mom gave a brittle laugh. You found Gavin's rehabilitation address. I mailed what you handed me. You opened the safe with me. I believed Meredith had made her decision. You had already moved Eleanor's money. Their voices rose together, each correcting the other with details neither had intended to admit. Gavin placed the old shipping envelope beside the tracing page. This is the third and final document Meredith brought, he said. Arthur used his corporate shipping account to send the ring. Dad looked at him. Constance assured me Meredith wanted it returned. No, Mom said. You said the ring would keep him from questioning the email. Arthur's face tightened. You are lying to protect yourself. So are you. I closed the document case. I'm not deciding which of you is telling the truth tonight, I said. The records, testimony, and accounting process will do that. Malcolm had remained near the end of the table, saying little. Now he took out his phone. Arthur saw the movement. This has nothing to do with Pierce infrastructure. You just acknowledged using a company account for a personal package tied to an undisclosed financial dispute, Malcolm said. It was a shipping charge from 17 years ago. Possibly, that is why the company preserves records before drawing conclusions. Dad lowered his voice. Malcolm, we have worked together for 30 years. And that is why I will follow the same process we would use for anyone else. Malcolm stepped away from the table and called the company's chief executive and general counsel. He did not announce a firing. He did not accuse Arthur of a crime. When he returned, his tone remained formal. Corporate counsel received a preservation request before this dinner, Malcolm said. Based on statements made tonight, access associated with relevant archived systems and current record repositories will be placed on hold while an independent review begins. You cannot suspend me over a family argument, Arthur said. This is not a suspension announcement, Malcolm replied. It is a data preservation measure. The chief executive and counsel will contact you tomorrow. For the first time that evening, Dad had no prepared sentence. Tessa left the table and hurried toward the hallway Dean had used. Constance followed her, calling her name. Arthur remained beside his chair, staring at the old envelope. Gavin held my coat while I slipped my arms into the sleeves. We thanked Dean's parents' empty seats because gratitude had nowhere else to go. Then headed toward the terrace. Mom caught us near the doors. You destroyed the most important night of your sister's life, Constance said. Her mascara had gathered beneath one eye, and her breath smelled faintly of champagne. I tried to leave before any financial document came out. You brought them. I brought protection against another lie. You could have stayed silent. I did that for 17 years. Constance reached for my arm. I stepped back before her fingers closed around it. I did not destroy Tessa's engagement, I said. I stopped using my silence to hold it together. Outside, rotor wash no longer moved the leaves. The aircraft had been secured after the exercise, and the flight crew was completing its records inside the operations wing. Gavin and I walked toward the parking area instead. My phone vibrated before we reached the car. Nora's email confirmed that the petition for a compulsory accounting had been filed that afternoon. A court date had not yet been assigned. The legal process had not begun because Gavin arrived in a helicopter. It had begun before anyone lifted a champagne glass. By 8 the next morning, 3 messages waited on my phone. Arthur wanted to meet privately and prove Constance had acted alone. Constance wanted protection before Arthur blamed her for the money. Tessa offered to surrender her complete cloud folder if I would confirm she had only been another victim. Each of them was finally ready to tell the truth. Only the version that saved them. The morning after Tessa's engagement dinner, each member of my family offered me a different version of the truth. Arthur wanted to meet at his attorney's office. Constance suggested a quiet lunch where women could speak honestly. Tessa sent 17 messages before noon, each one insisting she had been young, frightened, pressured, confused, or some combination of all 4. I answered them through Nora. No private bargains, no promises about testimony. No one would receive protection in exchange for giving me a version that placed the largest share of blame on someone else. The documents would go through the estate proceeding, and each person could tell the truth under oath. Arthur called me himself after receiving Nora's response. You are letting strangers dismantle this family, he said. I am letting professionals review records you refuse to explain. Your mother acted without my knowledge. You mailed the ring. At her request. You transferred Grandma's money. With her approval, then produced the approval. Silence filled the line. Arthur changed direction. Tessa received the benefit. Why are you protecting her? I am not. That answer seemed to surprise him. For most of my life, Dad had relied on the idea that I would eventually step between danger and my sister. If he made Tessa's punishment severe enough, I would soften my position to save her. He had used that pattern when we were children, and he expected it to survive every fact I had uncovered. It did not. The court proceeding moved slowly. The first conference took place in November, nearly 2 months after the engagement dinner. Arthur's attorney asked for additional time to collect old banking records. Nora agreed to a limited extension because refusing would have accomplished nothing except make us look unreasonable. By January, the missing structure had begun to appear. Arthur had acted as Eleanor's financial agent while she was alive. After her death, He became executor under her will. Those were separate roles, with separate duties, and the accounting had blurred them together. The bank produced archived check images and transfer documents. Eleanor's attorney produced correspondence showing she had established the land sale account for care expenses and had questioned Arthur about its falling balance before her second stroke. The escrow company no longer held every original record from Tessa's apartment purchase, but it retained a closing ledger and a copy of the cashier's check. The check number matched the image preserved in Eleanor's box. Lillian traced the same dollars as far as the records allowed. She did not claim every cent in my parents' joint account belonged to Eleanor. She separated the amounts that could be documented from those that could only be suspected. That restraint mattered. The cleaner her work became, the less room Arthur had to dismiss it as a daughter's revenge. Constance gave the first sworn statement. She admitted sending the false email and using language from my journal. She claimed Arthur had told her the separation would be temporary, just long enough for him to restore the care funds before I left New York. Arthur's attorney objected to nearly every sentence. Then Dad gave his statement. He said Constance had panicked over Gavin's dangerous career and acted on her own. According to him, he mailed the ring because his wife assured him I had ended the engagement and was too distressed to handle the package myself. Nora placed the shipping receipt in front of him. The label had been created before the false email was sent. Arthur stared at the timestamp. His attorney requested a break. That detail broke the story he had prepared. If the package was already being arranged before Constance sent the email, he could not honestly claim he had merely responded afterward to my supposed decision. When questioning resumed, Dad said he no longer remembered the exact sequence. He remembered enough to blame my mother, not enough to explain his own employee code on the label. Tessa's testimony came last. She provided the complete cloud folder after Nora refused to describe her as an innocent victim in exchange for cooperation. The metadata showed she had scanned every letter and financial document in Eleanor's box 8 years earlier. Her messages with Constance were worse than the excerpts we had already seen. Tessa had asked whether she should sell the apartment before anyone discovered the source of the down payment. Constance told her not to move too quickly because a sudden sale might attract questions. Years later, when Tessa did sell, she asked Arthur whether she should keep part of the proceeds in a separate account. Arthur replied, "Keep your records private. Meredith has no reason to see them." Tessa tried to explain that she had followed her parents' advice. Nora asked, "Were you an adult when you found the letters?" "Yes," Tessa said. "Did anyone prevent you from contacting Meredith?" "No." "Did you understand that the letters contradicted what Meredith had been told?" "Yes." "Did you preserve copies because you believed the documents could protect you if your parents blamed you?" Tessa's voice dropped. "Yes." "Did you provide those same documents to Meredith?" "No." The room stayed still. For the first time, my sister's fear could not disguise itself as confusion. She had understood the truth well enough to save it for herself. Pierce Infrastructure completed its separate review in February. Malcolm did not control the decision alone. The chief executive, general counsel, audit committee, and outside investigators reviewed Arthur's conduct. The shipping charge from 17 years earlier was minor by itself, but it opened questions about his annual integrity certifications and his handling of conflicts that involved entrusted family funds. Investigators found additional personal expenses coded through business accounts. None was enormous. Together, they showed a pattern of treating any system he controlled as an extension of his own wallet. Arthur was given the choice to resign or face termination proceedings under his employment agreement. He resigned. The announcement described his departure as the conclusion of an internal review. The company did not publish our family history, and I did not send it to anyone. Dad had built his reputation around the belief that he was too careful to be questioned. He lost it because every lie required a document. And documents were the one thing he had always trusted more than people. By spring, my parents were no longer presenting a united defense. Arthur filed for legal separation and claimed Constance had exposed the family to liability through her independent actions. Constance's attorney responded with emails showing Dad directed the timing, controlled the money, and told her which details to give me after Gavin's accident. Tessa gave both sides selected messages, hoping cooperation would protect her from repayment. Instead, each document completed another section of the record. They did not fall because I outsmarted them in one perfect moment. They fell because self-preservation made them tell the truth about one another. The estate dispute ended in a negotiated settlement before trial. Arthur and Constance agreed to restore the documented principal removed from Eleanor's account, along with calculated interest and a large share of the accounting and legal costs. Tessa accepted responsibility for the portion tied to her apartment, but anything she paid reduced the amount owed by my parents. The estate did not collect the same loss twice. To fund the settlement, Arthur and Constance sold their vacation property. Their primary house went on the market during the separation, though the sale had not closed by the time I told this story. Tessa used part of the remaining proceeds from her apartment sale, sold her luxury car, and entered a structured payment agreement for the balance. Dean did not return. He sent me one email several weeks after the engagement dinner. He said he was sorry for believing Tessa's description of me before asking for evidence. I told him he had done the right thing when it mattered. He had asked questions before marrying her. Tessa requested a private meeting in June. We met at a cafe near Washington Park. She arrived without our parents, without a lawyer, and without the engagement ring. For several minutes, she talked about the apartment, the years she had spent believing it was the only proof she could succeed, and the terror she felt when she discovered the money beneath it was not clean. I knew you had lost Gavin, she said, but losing the apartment felt immediate. It felt like my whole life would disappear. You knew what my whole life had already lost. Her eyes lowered. I thought you were stronger than me, she said. That was the family excuse. I know. No, Tessa. You used it too. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not argue. I do love you, she said. I know. Will you ever forgive me? I stirred my coffee, though the sugar had already dissolved. I do not know. How long will it take? You do not get a deadline. Her face tightened, then settled. For once, Tessa did not ask me to make uncertainty easier for her. She picked up her bag and left after paying for her own coffee. That was not reconciliation. It was the first conversation we had ever had where neither of us pretended forgiveness was owed because we shared parents. Constance continued writing letters. Some contained apologies. Others explained again why she had feared Gavin's career and why a mother sometimes made decisions her children could not understand. I read the first 3. After that, I sent the unopened envelopes to Nora's office for safekeeping and asked Mom to stop. Arthur never apologized. He sent me a list of apartments he and Constance were considering after selling the house and asked whether I could review the leases. He ended the message with one familiar sentence. You have always been best at these things. I stared at it for a long time. Then I sent him the names of 3 public tenant assistance services and nothing more. His reply came within minutes. After everything I did for this family, this is how you treat me? I blocked the number. Gavin and I did not rush into a large wedding. We chose a date in early autumn and invited fewer than 30 people. Laurel agreed to stand beside him. Nora received an invitation, as did Lillian and several friends who knew us as we were now, not as the young couple frozen in a 17-year-old photograph. One evening in July, Gavin and I ate dinner on my apartment balcony while rain moved across Albany in a silver curtain. My phone vibrated against the table. A voicemail notification appeared from Constance. A medical bill had arrived for Arthur. The insurance company was questioning a code, and she did not know which office to call. For years, that message would have ended dinner. I would have opened my laptop, found the policy, contacted the provider, and fixed the problem before anyone had to feel helpless. Gavin glanced at the screen but did not ask what I planned to do. That mattered too. I turned the phone face down. Do you need to handle it? He asked. No. The word came easily. We continued eating while the rain tapped against the railing. Nothing terrible happened because I stayed seated. My parents found someone else to call, or they solved it themselves. I never asked which. They had called me strong for most of my life, whenever they needed permission to place another burden in my hands. In the end, strength was not carrying it better. Strength was leaving it on the table. When your family calls you the strong one, pay attention to what they ask you to carry. Strength should never mean paying everyone's bills, fixing every crisis, protecting every lie, or accepting less because someone else is considered too fragile to face consequences. You can love your relatives and still require receipts, clear explanations, shared responsibility, and respect for your decisions. When facts do not match the story you have been given, slow down and verify them. Save emails, letters, contracts, bank statements, and important text messages. Speak with qualified professionals before making accusations, signing agreements, or accepting a settlement. Do not let anger push you into public revenge that could damage your credibility. Meredith succeeded because she preserved evidence, followed legal procedures, and allowed each person's own words to expose their choices. You should also remember that respecting another person's boundaries does not require abandoning your own questions. When a relationship ends through confusing messages, secondhand explanations, or missing information, ask for direct confirmation while you still have the chance. Pride may protect you from immediate rejection, but it can also keep you trapped inside a lie someone else created. Forgiveness is not a deadline, and family ties do not erase accountability. An apology without honesty, repayment, and changed behavior is only another request for you to absorb the damage. You are allowed to stop solving problems for people who repeatedly create them. Give them the phone number, the public resource, or the professional service, then let them handle the next step themselves. The clearest lesson is practical. Document important decisions, question unexplained money, communicate directly, and never confuse being needed with being loved. Sometimes the healthiest choice is not carrying the burden more gracefully. It is putting it down. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories about betrayal, accountability, and women who finally choose themselves.